During Christmas, I announced my pregnancy. My mother said, "You are dead to our family now." So I left my present and walked out. When she opened that box, she screamed nonstop. The drive up the winding, tree-lined driveway of the Lake Oswego estate on that crisp Christmas morning felt less like a holiday visit and more like a slow march toward a firing squad. The tires of my car crunched softly against the fresh, untouched snow, a stark contrast to the heavy, suffocating anxiety sitting in my chest. On the passenger seat next to me sat a perfectly wrapped box. It was draped in expensive silver paper with a deep green velvet ribbon, exactly the kind of elegant, understated presentation my mother demanded for the holidays. But this box was heavy. It was heavy because it felt like a bomb waiting to detonate. I was 28 years old, 7 months pregnant, and I was about to drop a payload that would shatter my family's pristine, carefully curated image forever. To understand why I was bringing a weapon wrapped in silver paper to a family Christmas dinner, you have to understand the world I was born into. My name is Claire Harrington. If you are from Portland, Oregon, or anywhere in the Pacific Northwest, you might recognize the last name. We are what people call old money. It is not the flashy, reality television kind of wealth. It is the quiet, oppressive, country club kind of wealth. The kind of wealth where people communicate their disdain not by yelling, but by raising a perfectly arched eyebrow and taking a slow, deliberate sip of imported sparkling water while they decide you are no longer worth their time. My mother, Catherine, is the undisputed queen of this cold kingdom. For as long as I can remember, she never saw me as a daughter. I was an accessory. I was an investment property. In her mind, my sole purpose was to graduate from a top-tier university, marry a corporate lawyer or a hedge fund manager with an equally impressive pedigree, and produce well-bred grandchildren who could be paraded around her charity luncheons like prized show ponies. Catherine measures a person's worth entirely by their zip code, their bank account balance, and their ability to elevate her own social standing. If you do not fit into her neatly organized portfolio of acceptable human beings, you simply do not exist in her world. Growing up under her roof was like living in a museum where you were never allowed to touch the exhibits, and you were constantly reminded that you were the least valuable artifact on display. There was no unconditional love in the Harrington household. Love was a currency, tightly controlled, taxed, and only distributed when you performed exactly as expected. And I, unfortunately for my mother, was a terrible performer. I always saw through the hollow charade. I hated the forced smiles at the country club. I hated the way my mother spoke to the serving staff, using a tone that was sickly sweet but dripped with a terrifying superiority. I hated the constant, suffocating pressure to be perfect in a way that felt entirely fake. So, I started quietly rebelling early on. I didn't do it with drugs or wild parties. I did it by simply refusing to care about the things she worshipped. I wore thrift store clothes, I read books about social justice instead of attending debutante balls, and I developed a thick skin to survive her constant critiques. But no matter how thick your skin gets, a mother's rejection always finds a way to cut through the layers. I always thought I understood exactly how cold my mother could be. I thought I had seen the absolute bottom of her cruelty. But I was incredibly naive. I had no idea just how low she would sink, or what she was truly capable of, until a certain Tuesday in May many years later when my world collided with a man who represented everything she feared. The stark contrast in how my mother treated her children becomes blindingly obvious when you look at my younger brother, Connor. Connor is 25 years old, and if my mother were to write a dictionary, his picture would be right next to the word perfection. To the rest of the world, however, Connor is a completely useless, entitled nightmare who has never known the value of a hard day's work. While I was pushing myself through exhausting nursing rotations and staying up all night studying, Connor was living in the massive guest house on my parents' estate, supposedly finding himself. Finding himself apparently required playing high-end video games until 4 in the morning on a computer that cost more than my car, sleeping until noon, and never holding a job for longer than 3 weeks because he felt every boss he had was beneath his intellect. But in Catherine's eyes, Connor could do no wrong. He was the golden heir to a legacy he did nothing to build. The reason for this favoritism was simple. Connor was completely dependent on her. He never challenged her authority because he was too afraid of losing his allowance. He let her buy his clothes, pick his social circle, and dictate his entire life, all in exchange for a limitless supply of funds. My mother did not want independent children who thought for themselves. She wanted hostages who suffered from a very comfortable version of Stockholm Syndrome. Connor was the golden boy because he was too lazy and too pampered to fly away from the golden cage she had built for him. I, on the other hand, was the disappointment because I actually wanted to build a life that was my own. The only person in the family who truly saw through my mother's toxic charade was my grandfather, Harrison Harrington. He was the man who built the family lumber empire from nothing back in the 1950s. He was a rugged, brilliant man who always smelled faintly of sawdust and expensive cologne, even in his 80s. Grandfather Harrison hated the snobbery that had infected his family like a slow-growing rot. He often told me that wealth without hard work was just a fast track to moral decay. He loved that I wanted to work for a living. He loved that I wasn't afraid to get my hands dirty. When we were alone in his study, surrounded by old leather-bound books and the trophies of a life spent building something real, he would often shake his head while listening to my mother host her pretentious gatherings downstairs. "Claire, my girl," he would say, his voice a gravelly rumble, "your mother thinks money makes her royalty. She forgets that the only real royalty in this world is earned through sweat, character, and how you treat the people who have nothing to give you in return." Grandfather Harrison passed away when I was 21. It was the darkest day of my life. The family narrative was that he left everything to my father, Charles, who in turn let my mother manage the vast majority of the estate's affairs. Catherine strutted around after the funeral as if she had just been crowned queen of a small nation. She thought she possessed total, absolute control over the Harrington legacy and my future. But Grandfather Harrison was a very smart man, and he knew exactly who his daughter-in-law really was. He left behind a massive legacy, yes. But he also left behind a trapdoor. A brilliant, legally binding trapdoor buried deep in his estate planning, one that Catherine never suspected existed. Instead of going to a prestigious business school to learn how to manage hedge funds or negotiate corporate acquisitions as my mother expected, I chose to become a registered nurse. Specifically, an emergency room nurse. When I announced my career choice at the dinner table one Sunday evening, the silence was so profound you could actually hear the ice cubes melting in my father's whiskey glass. My mother slowly, delicately placed her silver fork down on her fine china plate. "Nursing," she asked, pronouncing the word as if she were describing a particularly nasty contagious disease. "Claire, darling, nursing is a lovely little charitable activity for the lower classes. It is a hobby, not a career for a Harrington. You will be spending your life cleaning up after undesirable people. Why on earth would you choose to be the help?" I looked at my father, Charles, hoping for even a shred of support. But my father is a man who traded his spine for a life of luxury and silence a long time ago. Whenever my mother goes on the attack, Charles simply retreats behind the financial section of the newspaper and pours himself another drink, pretending the conflict isn't happening right in front of him. He never once stood up for me. So, I stood up for myself. I packed my bags, moved into a tiny, cramped apartment in downtown Portland, and paid my own way through nursing school by working double shifts as a waitress and a nurse's aide. I didn't want a single penny of their clean money to fund my education. The emergency room became my sanctuary. It is loud, chaotic, often heartbreaking, and sometimes smells like things you'd rather not think about, but it is the most honest place on earth. In the ER, your bank account balance does not matter. When you are bleeding, when you are in pain, or when you are taking your very last breath, all the superficial nonsense of the social world burns away in an instant. Blood is the same shade of red whether you are a wealthy CEO from Lake Oswego or a homeless man struggling on the streets of downtown. I loved my job because it was real. It was the exact, polar opposite of the Harrington estate. My mother, of course, never stopped making her snide, passive-aggressive remarks. If I showed up to a family holiday looking tired because I had just spent 12 hours saving lives, she would loudly announce to her friends that I was exhausting myself doing manual labor, as if I were a common laborer from the 19th century. She treated my entire career like a rebellious teenage phase that I would eventually grow out of once I came to my senses. She constantly tried to set me up with men from her social circle, arrogant junior executives who spent the entire dinner talking about their golf handicaps and looking at me as if I were a trophy to be won. I rejected every single one of them. My life settled into a comfortable, exhausting routine of 12-hour shifts, black coffee, and avoiding my mother's frequent, judgmental phone calls. I was content with being single. I had convinced myself that I did not need a partner, especially since the only model of marriage I had ever seen was the toxic, loveless business arrangement my parents called a life. I was perfectly fine living my straight, predictable, independent life. But fate has a funny way of interrupting your plans when you least expect it, especially on a rainy Tuesday evening when a certain guy with road rash walked through the sliding doors of the emergency room and changed everything I thought I knew about love. He walked into the ER holding his left arm, wearing a torn leather jacket and a sheepish, infectious grin that immediately cut through the stress of my shift. His name was Diego Navarro. He was 25 years old, with long dark hair tied back in a messy bun, dark eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and arms that were covered in some of the most intricate, beautiful tattoos I had ever seen. He had taken a spill on his motorcycle because the notorious Portland rain had turned the streets into a slip-and-slide, and he had slid a few yards across the pavement. It wasn't life-threatening, just a nasty case of road rash that needed a very thorough cleaning and dressing. As I began the tedious process of cleaning the gravel out of his arm, a process that usually makes grown men whine, curse, or pass out, Diego just laughed softly. "I guess this means my career as an underwear model is officially over," he joked, wincing only slightly as I applied the antiseptic. I looked up, genuinely surprised. Usually, the attractive guys who came into my ER were either incredibly arrogant, demanding immediate attention, or they were terrified of the slightest bit of pain. Diego was neither. He was entirely at ease with himself. As I worked, we started talking. He told me he was a tattoo artist who owned a small, struggling but passionate shop in East Portland. He talked about his art not as a job, but as a way of telling people's stories on their skin. He talked about his loud, chaotic, and incredibly close-knit Mexican-American family, and how he had spent 3 months designing a custom memorial piece for a client who had lost their brother. What struck me most wasn't his looks, although he was undeniably handsome. It was how he looked at me. When he asked about my day, he actually stopped talking and listened to the answer. He didn't look at my name tag and try to figure out if I was related to the Harrington fortune. He didn't look at me like a prize to be won or an investment to be secured for a corporate merger. He just saw Claire, the tired nurse with messy hair under a surgical cap and bags under her eyes, and he acted like she was the most fascinating person he had ever met. By the time I finished bandaging his arm, we had been talking for over 45 minutes. I realized with a start that I was smiling so hard my cheeks actually hurt, a sensation I hadn't felt in a very long time. As I handed him his discharge papers and instructions on how to care for the wound, he looked at me, hesitating for just a second. "Listen," he said, his voice dropping to a lower, more serious tone. "I know you're a professional and you're probably not supposed to date patients you've just scrubbed gravel out of. And I know I currently look like a guy who just lost a fight with a sidewalk. But if you ever want to get coffee with someone who promises not to crash his motorcycle on the way to the cafe, I'd really love to take you out." I knew I should have said no. I knew I should have maintained my professional distance and kept my life simple. But looking into his warm, honest eyes, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years: hope. I realized that for the first time in my life, someone was interested in me, not my family's shadow. I wrote my number on the back of a hospital card and handed it to him. That simple conversation started a fire in my life. But even then, in the back of my mind, I knew that in the Harrington family, fires are suffocated before they are allowed to spread. I knew loving a man like Diego would be a death sentence to my mother's carefully managed reputation. And I was absolutely right. For the first year and a half of our relationship, Diego and I lived in a beautiful, insulated bubble. Dating him was like stepping into a vibrant, living painting after spending my entire life trapped in a cold, black and white photograph. The contrast between his world and mine was staggering, and I quickly found myself craving the warmth of his world like it was oxygen. The first time he took me to his parents' house in East Portland, I was absolutely terrified. I was used to the Harrington dining room, where every dinner was a silent, anxious affair scored only by the clinking of expensive silver against porcelain and the quiet, heavy judgment of my mother. But the Navarro house was a sensory explosion. The moment Diego opened the front door, I was hit by the incredible smell of roasting meats, warm tortillas, and rich, earthy spices. Music was playing loudly from a radio in the kitchen. There were at least 15 people crammed into the modest living room, aunts, uncles, cousins, and kids running around screaming with genuine joy. Diego's mother, a short, incredibly warm woman with a fierce hug that made me feel safe instantly, pulled me into the kitchen. She didn't ask about my pedigree. She didn't care about my education. She handed me a plate piled high with food and treated me like I had been part of the family for decades. Nobody asked what my father did for a living. They asked me if I was happy. They laughed at my stories. When Diego put his arm around my waist, his father smiled and offered me a beer. There was no pretense, no hidden agendas. There was just unconditional, chaotic, and beautiful love. It made me realize how utterly starved I had been for genuine human connection. But the bubble couldn't last forever. Eventually, the reality of my life caught up with us. I had to introduce Diego to the Harrington family. I put it off for as long as I could, making every excuse in the book, but when my mother demanded a formal Sunday dinner introduction, I knew the collision was unavoidable. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The massive, echoing dining room at the Lake Oswego estate felt like a frozen tundra compared to the Navarro home. My mother sat at the head of the table, wearing her signature pearls and a smile that never even came close to reaching her eyes. The interrogation began before the first course was even cleared. Catherine didn't use crude insults. That wasn't her style. She used polished, venomous inquiries designed to make a person feel small. "So, Diego," she began, delicately dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin. "A tattoo artist. How quaint. Tell me, what exactly is your long-term retirement strategy in such a volatile and unregulated industry? Do you have a diverse investment portfolio, or are you simply hoping to just draw pictures until your hands eventually give out?" My brother Connor sat across the table, smirking and playing with his phone, an expensive device entirely funded by my mother's purse, yet he acted like he held the moral high ground. Diego, bless his soul, handled it with supreme grace. He calmly explained his business model, his plans to expand his shop, and his disciplined savings strategy. He didn't get defensive. He answered every condescending question with polite, quiet honesty. But I could see the muscles in my mother's jaw twitching. She hated that he wasn't intimidated by her wealth. She hated that she couldn't break his spirit. I realized then that she didn't just dislike him, she saw his happiness as a direct insult to her way of life. The Sunday dinner was just the opening skirmish in what would become a long-term war of attrition. After that first introduction, Catherine realized that Diego wasn't just a brief act of rebellion or a phase I was going through. He was a permanent fixture in my heart. And because she couldn't intimidate him directly, she decided to try and humiliate him, to make him feel so unwelcome and out of place that he would simply choose to leave me on his own. The turning point in her campaign was Thanksgiving. I had explicitly told my mother at least 3 times that Diego had a severe, life-threatening allergy to pine nuts. It was a well-known fact in our relationship. But when we sat down for the grand Thanksgiving feast, surrounded by our extended family and several of my mother's wealthiest, most judgmental friends, the main stuffing dish was brought out with a flourish. I took one look at it and my blood ran cold. It was heavily, deliberately garnished with toasted pine nuts. I looked directly at my mother. She looked back at me with wide, fake innocent eyes. "Oh, dear me," she gasped, placing a slender hand to her chest in a theatrical display of shock. I completely forgot about Diego's little dietary quirk. The chef has already prepared everything. I suppose he'll just have to stick to the side salad and the rolls. It's such a shame, really. It's an old family recipe, and it's quite delicious. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate, calculated act of sabotage. She was trying to force a choice. Either Diego makes a scene and looks like an ungrateful, difficult guest in front of her high society friends, or I explode at my mother and ruin the holiday for everyone, proving to her guests that Diego was making me unstable and hostile. My father stared down at his plate, choosing his meal over his daughter's dignity, as he always did. Connor actually chuckled under his breath. I was about to stand up, grab my coat, and drag Diego out of that house forever, but Diego gently placed his hand over mine under the table. He gave my hand a slow, reassuring squeeze. He looked right at my mother, smiled warmly, and said, "That is perfectly fine, Mrs. Harrington. The salad looks absolutely incredible, and honestly, getting to spend time with Claire's family is the real treat today. I wouldn't want to cause any trouble or be a burden." He sat there and ate plain lettuce and dry turkey while the rest of the table feasted on the gourmet meal. He engaged the other guests in charming, intelligent conversation, making them laugh and completely disarming the awkward tension my mother had tried so hard to create. He was perfect in the face of her cruelty. And that is exactly why Catherine was furious. I watched her grip her wine glass so tightly her knuckles turned white. She realized in that moment that Diego Navarro could not be bullied, he could not be bought, and he could not be humiliated into leaving me. I realized then that my mother didn't just dislike him. She viewed our love as a direct threat to her absolute control over my life. She wanted to destroy him because she couldn't own him. She wanted to destroy us to prove she was still the one in charge. And I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that this was only the beginning. Soon, she would try something much worse. Thank you so much for listening to my story so far. If you are enjoying the journey, please take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below with the name of the city you are living in. Every single comment helps the video reach more people, and I truly appreciate your support. Let's get back to the story. The war had silently been declared by my mother, but inside the safety of Diego's small apartment, we were busy building a fortress of our own. The proposal didn't happen on a yacht, at a 5-star restaurant in Paris, or during some grand, staged event for social media. It happened on a random, unremarkable Tuesday evening in May. I had just come off a brutal 14-hour shift at the hospital. My hair was tied up in a messy, frizzy knot, I smelled faintly of medical sanitizer and old coffee, and I was wearing one of Diego's oversized, paint-stained t-shirts. We were standing in his tiny, cramped kitchen, making a simple dinner of spaghetti. He was telling me a funny story about a client who wanted a portrait of their pet iguana, and then, mid-sentence, he just stopped talking. I looked up from stirring the sauce to see him wiping his hands on a kitchen towel, taking a deep, shaky breath, and getting down on one knee right there on the worn linoleum floor. There was no grand, rehearsed speech. Just Diego, looking up at me with eyes so full of genuine love it made my chest physically ache. "Claire," he said, his voice trembling just a little. "I don't have a mansion to give you, and I can't promise you a life of luxury or country club memberships. But I can promise you that I will choose you every single day for the rest of my life. I will be your home, no matter where we are. Will you marry me?" He opened a small, hand-carved wooden box. Inside was not a massive, flawless diamond that my mother would have expected and appraised for its resale value. It was a ring he had designed and crafted himself. It featured 2 small, beautiful stones, our birthstones, intertwined in a delicate band of silver. It probably cost a fraction of what a standard engagement ring costs at a jewelry store, but to me, it was the most priceless object in the entire universe. It represented 2 very different lives twisting together to become one unbreakable thing. I dropped the wooden spoon into the sauce, fell to my knees on the floor with him, and said yes before he even finished holding the box out. We spent the next hour laughing, crying, and eventually eating cold spaghetti right off the floor. I was the happiest I had ever been in my 28 years of life. But the real world and the Harrington family were waiting for the news. The next morning, I made the phone call. I knew better than to go to the Lake Oswego estate in person. I needed the safety of distance. I dialed my mother's number, my heart pounding a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. When she answered, her voice was its usual crisp, businesslike tone, the sound of someone who was always in charge of the conversation. "Mother," I said, trying with all my might to keep my voice steady. "I'm calling to share some good news. Diego proposed last night. We are getting married." There was silence on the other end of the line. Not a brief, thoughtful pause. It was a long, heavy, suffocating silence that stretched on for exactly 10 seconds. I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in her hallway through the receiver, sounding like a countdown. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely devoid of emotion. It was clinical, detached, and terrifyingly cold. "I see," Catherine said softly. "So, you're officially deciding to throw your potential away. You understand, Claire, that you are ruining your social standing forever. You are tying yourself to a man with no future, no pedigree, and absolutely no ability to provide for the kind of life you were born into. You are destroying your husband's investment portfolio, or lack thereof, for a temporary, romantic whim with a blue-collar worker. It's a tragedy, really." "Mother, I love him," I fired back, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and hurt. "And I have my own career. I can provide for myself. I don't need a portfolio to be happy. Wiping up blood in an emergency room is not a career. It is a chore for people who don't have better options," she snapped, her polite mask slipping just a fraction to reveal the bile underneath. "I will not have my friends at the club laughing at me because my daughter married a street artist who lives in a rental. If you go through with this ridiculous stunt, do not expect the Harrington family to endorse or support it in any way." The line went dead. She had hung up on me. The battle lines were no longer hidden. We were officially going to war, and she had just fired the first shot. The 6 months leading up to our wedding were not filled with the typical excitement of a bride-to-be. Instead, they were a grueling exercise in emotional endurance. Catherine Harrington, my mother, realized quite quickly that her blunt force trauma tactics over the telephone were not going to sway me. So, she pivoted to a much more dangerous strategy, a slow, suffocating financial and social siege. She initially sent over a wedding planner, a woman with a tight bun and an even tighter smile, who informed me that my mother had already tentatively booked the grand ballroom at her exclusive country club for a date in November. The catch, of course, was that this gift came with a heavy, invisible chain of conditions. If Catherine paid, Catherine controlled. She wanted to vet the guest list, ensuring that her elite circle of bridge partners and charity board members outweighed Diego's family 3-1. She even suggested, with a chilling lack of self-awareness, that Diego's family could be seated in a secondary, smaller dining area so they wouldn't feel overwhelmed by the high society atmosphere. It was a thinly veiled attempt to segregate our wedding. I refused every single cent. I told the wedding planner to leave, and I told my mother that if she wanted to attend, she would attend as a guest, not a director. Diego and I scraped together every dollar we had saved. We chose a small, historic chapel in the heart of downtown Portland, a place with worn wooden pews and stained glass that actually felt sacred, rather than expensive. We booked a local community hall for the reception, where the floorboards creaked, but the echoes were full of life. The day arrived in late November. The Oregon air was crisp and biting, smelling of wet cedar and winter frost. Walking down that aisle felt like navigating a geopolitical border between two warring nations. On the right side of the chapel sat the Navarro family. It was a vibrant, noisy sea of people. Diego's cousins were whispering and giggling, his aunts were already dabbing their eyes with lace handkerchiefs, and the entire side of the room felt like it was radiating heat. Diego's mother looked at me with so much pride it almost broke my heart. Then, there was the left side. It was a barren, icy wasteland. Catherine had successfully leaned on our extended family, whispering about my rebellious phase and making it clear that attending this wedding was a betrayal of the Harrington legacy. Only my father, Charles, my brother Connor, and Catherine herself occupied the front pew. My mother wore a dress that was a shade of navy blue so dark it was practically charcoal, the color of a funeral. She sat with a rigid, military posture, her hands gloved and folded tightly in her lap. Her face was a masterclass in polite misery. Throughout the entire ceremony, as Diego and I exchanged vows that we had written with our own blood, sweat, and tears, she didn't blink. She didn't smile. She didn't offer a single tear of joy. The reception was a beautiful, chaotic explosion of culture. There was a mariachi band, there was incredible food, and there was a sense of genuine community that I had never experienced in my life. But my parents didn't stay for the toasts. Catherine claimed she felt a shattering migraine coming on and demanded my father take her home before the cake was even cut. As I watched their black town car pull away from the community center, leaving the sounds of laughter and trumpets behind, I felt a strange sense of liberation. I thought that by surviving the wedding, I had won. I thought the worst of her cruelty was behind me. I was so incredibly wrong. Life has a way of interrupting your plans just when you think you've finally gained control of the steering wheel. 6 months after the wedding, in the middle of a particularly rainy May, I realized my life was about to change again. Diego and I had a 5-year plan. We were going to expand his tattoo shop, I was going to finish my specialized certification in trauma nursing, and we were going to save exactly $50,000 for a down payment on a house in a quiet neighborhood. But biology doesn't care about spreadsheets. I had been feeling a bone-deep exhaustion that I couldn't shake. I blamed it on a series of 12-hour night shifts in the ER, where we had been dealing with an influx of flu cases and minor accidents. But then came the morning where the smell of Diego's favorite dark roast coffee made me bolt for the bathroom. I sat on the cold tile floor of our small apartment, staring at the digital readout on the plastic stick. Pregnant. When I told Diego, he didn't panic about the money or the timing. He just picked me up and spun me around in our tiny kitchen, laughing until he cried. He started talking to my belly that very night, promising our child that they would grow up in a house full of art and music. But even in that moment of pure joy, the shadow of Lake Oswego loomed over me. I felt a cold knot of dread in my stomach whenever I thought about telling Catherine. Over the next few weeks, as my body began to change, my mother's psychological harassment reached a new, feverish pitch. She started sending me daily text messages, often late at night or during my shift, filled with helpful articles about the rising costs of private education or the dangers of living in high-crime areas, her coded language for East Portland. Every time my phone vibrated with her specific notification sound, I felt a physical jolt of panic. As a nurse, I began to monitor myself with clinical detachment. I would sit in the break room at the hospital, wrap a blood pressure cuff around my arm, and watch the numbers climb. 140/90. Then 150/95. My resting heart rate was hovering at 105 beats per minute. I was suffering from clinical tachycardia and gestational hypertension, and I knew exactly what the trigger was. Every time Catherine's name appeared on my screen, my body reacted like I was being hunted by a predator. Against my better judgment, I decided to inform her of the pregnancy over the phone, hoping for some shred of maternal instinct to surface. I was standing in the hospital garden, looking at the blooming roses, when I broke the news. There was no congratulations. There was no, "I'm so happy for you." Instead, my mother let out a long, theatrical sigh that sounded like air escaping a punctured tire. "Claire," she said, her voice dropping to that low, terrifyingly calm register she used when she was at her most manipulative. "This is a catastrophe. You are barely settled into that rental. You are tied to a man with no stable pedigree. A child will only anchor you to a life of mediocrity. You know, there are discreet ways to handle these types of mistakes. You could quietly visit a clinic, take a week of vacation, and we could move on as if this never happened. You don't have to ruin your life for a moment of carelessness." She was suggesting I terminate my child because the timing didn't suit her social calendar. My blood went cold. The roses in the garden seemed to lose their color. In that moment, something shifted inside me. The fear died, and in its place, a cold, hard determination took root. I realized I wasn't just protecting myself anymore, I was protecting my daughter. I hung up the phone without a word. I had 6 months until Christmas. 6 months to gather every piece of ammunition I could find to ensure that Catherine Harrington would never be able to touch my family again. Christmas morning in Portland was hauntingly beautiful. The city was draped in a rare, heavy blanket of snow that muffled the sounds of traffic and made everything feel still and expectant. I was 7 months pregnant now, my body heavy and my gait a bit slower, but my mind had never been sharper. I stood in front of the mirror in our bedroom, dressed in a simple but elegant maternity dress. I looked at my reflection and didn't see the frightened girl who used to flinch at my mother's disapproval. I saw a woman who was done being a victim. Diego was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He had spent the morning trying to convince me to let him come. "Claire, let me go with you," he pleaded. "You shouldn't have to face that woman alone. Not today. Not like this." I walked over and sat beside him, taking his large, tattooed hands in mine. "No," I said, my voice firm. "If you come, she'll make it about you. She'll use you as a target to distract from what I have to say. I need her to look at me, just me, when I end this. I need to do this for us, and I need to do it for our daughter." I kissed him goodbye, took the heavy box from the kitchen table, and walked out to my car. The box was a masterpiece of deception. I had wrapped it in shimmering silver paper that caught the winter light, tied with a luxurious emerald green velvet ribbon. It looked exactly like the kind of high-end gift Catherine expected to see under her 12-foot designer tree. But inside, it wasn't a silk scarf or a piece of jewelry. It was a dossier of her own destruction. The drive from East Portland to the Lake Oswego estate usually takes about 30 minutes, but with the snow, it stretched into a long, 45-minute journey. It was a meditative drive. As I passed the familiar landmarks of my childhood, the private school I hated, the country club where I felt like an exhibit, the manicured parks where I was never allowed to get my clothes dirty, I felt like I was driving through a ghost story. I remembered every holiday where I was criticized for my hair, my weight, or my grades. I remembered the year Catherine made me return a gift from a friend because it was unsuitably cheap. As I turned into the long, winding driveway of the Harrington estate, the iron gates groaned open. The house was illuminated with thousands of perfectly placed white lights, looking like a postcard for a life I no longer wanted any part of. I parked the car, took a deep breath of the freezing air to steady my heart rate, and picked up the heavy silver box. I wasn't afraid. I was focused. I walked up the stone steps and rang the bell, hearing the chimes echo through the hollow, expensive halls of my past. The door was opened by my mother herself. She was dressed in a cream-colored cashmere sweater set and tailored trousers, looking every bit the poised matriarch of a lumber empire. She didn't hug me. She didn't even wish me a Merry Christmas. Her eyes dropped immediately to my protruding stomach, and her mouth thinned into a hard, straight line of disapproval. "You're late, Claire," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "Leave your things in the foyer. And for heaven's sake, put your phone in the basket. We're having a traditional family morning, and I won't have it interrupted by whoever it is you talk to these days." I followed her into the grand living room. The air was thick with the scent of pine and expensive candles, but it felt cold. My father, Charles, was sitting in his usual wingback chair, nursing a glass of early morning scotch and staring at a tablet. My brother, Connor, was sprawled on the velvet sofa, scrolling through his phone with a bored, hungover expression. "Merry Christmas, everyone," I said, remaining standing in the center of the room. I didn't sit down. I wanted to maintain the height advantage. Catherine sat down on the sofa next to Connor, smoothing her hair. "Well, since you've decided to grace us with your presence, perhaps we can have a civilized discussion about your future. Your father and I have been talking, and we've decided that this situation has gone on long enough. You are clearly not thinking rationally." I looked at her, my heart beating at a steady, calm rhythm. "I'm pregnant, Mother. I told you that." I'm 7 months along. We're having a girl. I'm here because I wanted to give you one last chance to be a part of her life. The silence that followed was suffocating. Connor didn't even look up from his screen. My father suddenly found his drink very interesting. Catherine stood up slowly, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. All the polite society pretense vanished in an instant. A part of her life, she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. I will not have a bastard child with the blood of a street artist as my grandchild. You have dragged our name through the mud for long enough, Claire. You chose that man. You chose that life. And now you can live with the consequences. I am done with you. As far as I'm concerned, you are dead to this family now. I am cutting you out of the will, and you will never see a single cent of Harrington money again. Now, take your things and get out of my house before I have you removed. Connor let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. My father didn't say a word to defend me. He just kept staring at his scotch. I stood there for exactly 3 seconds, let the words sink in, and felt the final chord of my old life snap. I wasn't hurt. I was relieved. She had said exactly what I needed her to say. She had walked right into the trap. I didn't argue. I didn't plead for my inheritance, and I didn't try to explain the value of Diego to people who only understood the value of $1. I simply walked forward, my movements slow and deliberate because of the weight of my daughter, and I placed the silver-wrapped box in the center of the glass coffee table. It sat there, gleaming under the designer Christmas lights, looking like a peace offering. "Merry Christmas, Mother," I said quietly. I turned around and walked out. I didn't look back at the room, I didn't look at my father's slumped shoulders, and I didn't look at Connor's smirking face. I retrieved my coat and my phone from the foyer and stepped out into the biting Oregon cold. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove. I only made it about 4 blocks before I had to pull over. The adrenaline that had been keeping me upright suddenly evaporated, leaving me shaking. I gripped the steering wheel and let out a sob that felt like it was tearing out of my very soul. I cried for the mother I never had. I cried for the father who was too weak to love his own child. I cried for the 28 years I had spent trying to be enough for people who were fundamentally empty. But as the tears slowed, a new feeling took over. It was a lightness I had never known. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. The shoe had dropped, and it hadn't crushed me. I was Claire Navarro now, and I was free. I drove home to Diego, who was waiting on the porch with a blanket and a mug of hot chocolate. We spent the rest of the day in our small, warm apartment, surrounded by the smell of roasting chicken and the sound of music. I knew Catherine wouldn't open the box right away. She would leave it there, a trophy of her victory, waiting for a moment when she felt like gloating. I estimated it would take about 48 hours for her curiosity to outweigh her spite. I was right. On the afternoon of December 28th, as I was sitting on the sofa folding tiny baby clothes, my phone rang. It was an unrecognized number from a prestigious law firm in downtown Portland. My mother's personal estate attorney was on the line, and he sounded like he was having a very, very bad day. The payload had been delivered. The silver box didn't contain a gift. It contained an autopsy of Catherine Harrington's character. When she finally tore into that paper, she found 3 distinct layers of evidence that I had spent months meticulously gathering. The first layer was personal and medical. I had printed out every single toxic, manipulative text message she had sent me over the past year. I had highlighted the ones where she suggested I terminate my pregnancy. Below each message, I had attached my own medical charts from the hospital, records of my tachycardia, my spikes in blood pressure, and my stress-induced symptoms. I had included a signed letter from my physician stating that my mother's communication was a direct threat to the health of my unborn child. It was clinical proof that she was a predator. The second layer was financial. As a Harrington, I was technically a cosigner on a dormant medical trust fund my grandfather had set up for the grandchildren. My mother had forgotten that this gave me limited, read-only access to the oversight portal for the family's broader charity accounts. I had spent my late-night shifts at the hospital tracking a series of irregular, quiet withdrawals. Over the course of 2 years, Catherine had funneled exactly $43,000 from the family's charitable foundation into a private offshore account. From that account, the money flowed directly to my brother Connor to pay for his high-stakes online gambling debts and a luxury car he couldn't afford. She had been embezzling from her own charities to hide her son's failures, all while lecturing me about financial responsibility and Diego's lack of an investment portfolio. The hypocrisy was documented in black and white, complete with transaction IDs and dates. But the final layer was the one that truly destroyed her. It was a certified copy of a sealed addendum to Grandfather Harrison's will. My grandfather had been a shrewd judge of character. He had watched Catherine's treatment of me with growing disgust before he died. He knew she would eventually try to use his money to control me. So, he had added a poison pill clause. The clause stated that the bulk of his personal fortune, millions of dollars kept separate from the family business, was to be managed by Catherine as an executor, unless she ever attempted to disinherit or financially penalize me for my marriage or life choices. If she ever explicitly stated that I was cut out of the will, her executorship would be immediately terminated for breach of fiduciary duty to the family's moral legacy. The entire fortune would then bypass her and my father completely, transferring into an irrevocable trust in my name. By telling me I was dead to the family and out of the will in front of witnesses, my father and Connor, she had legally signed away her own power. She had fired herself from the Harrington legacy. The lawyer informed me that my mother was currently screaming in his lobby, demanding he fix it. But there was nothing to fix. Grandfather Harrison had built a trap, and Catherine had walked right into it with her head held high. The fallout from that box was like a series of controlled demolitions. When my father, Charles, was presented with the evidence of Catherine's embezzlement and the money she had secretly funneled to Connor, something in him finally snapped. The man who had spent 30 years hiding behind a newspaper realized he was married to a criminal who had bankrupted his trust. He filed for divorce 3 weeks later, a move that shocked the Lake Oswego social scene and stripped my mother of the perfect family image she worshipped. Catherine tried to strike back one last time. In early February, she called the hospital and tried to speak to my supervisor, Dr. Fiona Gallagher. She claimed that I was unstable, that I had stolen family documents, and that I was suffering from a mental break due to my pregnancy. She was trying to get me fired, to strip away the only thing I had built for myself. But Dr. Gallagher had known me for 5 years. She had seen me handle trauma cases with ice in my veins. She told my mother, in no uncertain terms, that if she ever called the hospital again, the hospital's legal team would file a harassment suit and a restraining order. Dr. Gallagher then pulled me aside, gave me a cup of tea, and told me I was one of the best nurses she had ever seen. My mother's last weapon had failed. In late February, my daughter Daisy was born. The hospital room was a world away from the cold halls of my childhood. It was filled with the Navarro family. Diego's sisters were decorating the room with streamers. His mother was holding my hand, and the air was thick with the smell of home-cooked food they had sneaked into the maternity ward. When Diego held Daisy for the first time, his tattooed arms cradling her tiny, perfect body, I knew that the cycle of conditional love had finally been broken. Daisy would never have to earn her place in this world. Catherine sent nothing. No flowers, no card. And I felt nothing but relief. I blocked her number, I blocked Connor, and I focused on the tiny life in my arms. I was finally part of a family that showed up, not because of a last name, but because of a genuine, unbreakable bond. My mother was left alone in that massive, echoing house. Her social circle vanished as the news of the embezzlement and the divorce spread. She became the very thing she hated most, a scandal. She had spent her life trying to preserve a legacy, only to realize that the only person who actually cared about that legacy was the daughter she had just thrown away. The final chapter of the story began 8 months later, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting on our porch in East Portland, watching Daisy crawl across a blanket in the grass. The doorbell rang, and when I looked through the glass, I didn't see a monster. I saw a ghost. It was Connor. But it wasn't the smirking, arrogant Connor I remembered. He was thin, his hair was unkempt, and he was wearing a cheap, wrinkled jacket. Without our mother's secret funnel of cash, he had been forced to face the real world for the first time. My father had cut him off entirely during the divorce, and Catherine was too broke and bitter to help him. "Claire," he said, his voice cracking. He didn't ask to come in. He just stood there on the steps. I just wanted to see her. The baby. I didn't open the door. I just watched him through the screen. He looked at Daisy on the grass, and for the first time in my life, I saw a look of genuine, human grief on his face. He realized what he had lost. He realized that while he was playing games and taking bribes, I was building something real. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For Christmas. For everything. I was a coward." I didn't forgive him immediately. Forgiveness is earned, not given. But I didn't shut the door in his face either. I told him that if he got a job, if he stayed clean, and if he stayed away from our mother's toxic influence, maybe, just maybe, he could meet his niece one day. It took him a year of working in a warehouse and living in a tiny studio apartment, but Connor actually did it. He became the uncle Daisy deserves, reliable, humble, and fiercely protective. A year after that explosive Christmas, Diego and I renewed our vows on Daisy's first birthday. We stood in our own backyard, surrounded by the people who had actually supported us through the fire. I looked at my husband, my daughter, and my brother, and I realized that my grandfather had been right. Wealth isn't about what's in your bank account, it's about who is standing next to you when the world gets cold. Sometimes, the most painful words a person can say to you are actually a gift. When my mother said I was dead to her, she didn't realize she was actually giving me my life back. Looking back at everything, my father recently reached out through his lawyer asking for a second chance to meet his granddaughter, claiming he was just a victim of my mother's control and that he was too intimidated to speak up. I refused to let him see Daisy. Am I wrong for keeping my daughter away from the grandfather who stood by silently and did nothing while I was being emotionally destroyed? Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button for more stories about finding strength when the people who should love you fail you completely. Don't forget to like the video and leave a comment with the name of the city you live in. Every interaction helps this story spread further. Thank you so much.